very much. Okay, now we switch gears completely to a completely different field, and we are very enthusiastic to hear the second talk, which will be given by Professor Gadi Algazi, and who is at present the head of the Department of General History, Tel Aviv University. Gadi received his BA and MA from Tel Aviv University and his PhD from the Göttingen University in Germany. He's a faculty member in Tel Aviv since 1993 and was a visiting professor in Paris, Berlin, and St. Petersburg. He's the editor of the journal History and Memory and the member of the editorial board of the journals Past and Present and Historical Anthropology. His research interests focus on the late medieval history in Europe and mainly in the German-speaking regions between 1350 and 600. He's interested in culture studies, anthropological history, and semantic history. He has published and edited several books and papers with titles which prove his intellectual interest and broad knowledge. I was just so amazed, so I must share with you a little bit of what he's doing, and the titles he's working with was Seigneurial Power and Violence in the Later Middle Ages, The Shape of Landscape, Love, a Code for Social Competence at the Abbasid Court, Food for Thought, Traveler, the Loise and the Astrolabe, Women, Books and Scholars. So after listening to all these interesting topics he's into it in research, we are going to listen to his talk. Actually, I heard his talk about food and globalization, and this was the incentive to invite him. It was a great talk, and now he's going to give us a talk on the historical perspective of food security. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is very kind, and there are many promises that are not to be fulfilled. It's very nice to have a walk on the east side of the campus and go back to my roots a bit. And I'll try to be as quick as possible and not get bogged in too many details. But I was thinking about Manna and the little quote from that you've seen whenever the Manna Center appears. And I think that's a good starting point. There are two things to be said about the children of Israel and Manna. That's my Bible, at least. First, it was a case of food substitution. This is not what the children of Israel actually wanted to have. What they wanted to have was good Egyptian food, onions and garlic, whatever that means in the original text, and we don't know, but they had to take whatever was given. I think that's interesting. And the second point about manna is that it is not for real, not because it is miraculous, but because it's part of the nomadic utopia. It's part of life in the desert without settled agriculture. And the moment they enter the land of Israel, I hope you remember this, there's a special announcement by God that there's not going to be any manna anymore. They have to work. And that's more or less where we begin in the complexity of agrarian civilizations. Now, I'm not going to offer you a review of historical food system, but try to make a few points about the things we learned in the history of culinary system and the history of food, with a very, very basic point in mind, although I'll try to offer you some specific insights later. And that is the social and cultural complexity is not a luxury. I know that it is very tempting to think about production, to think about yields, especially as a scientist. But I think in the previous talk, we have seen how social constraints and cultural tradition play a major role, and not only as constraints, but as sources of creativity that shape the way new solutions can emerge. Now, we can begin with production, and this is where most discussion of food security rightly begin. But I'll try to take a different approach. We often imagine pre-modern agricultural system and culinary systems as self-sufficient, almost self-reliant, utterly conservative, very localized, and turn upon themselves, which is based more or less what they were, and there's no need to realize. Every previous civilization we know of until more or less yesterday night, in historical terms, in an agrarian system, using where most of the population is working in agriculture, and using a set of techniques that was developed between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago at the very, if we are very nice about it. Every civilization we know of depends on the production of agricultural surplus, and the rest is just fun, philosophy, politics, universities, what have you, and this surplus was extremely fragile. Therefore, the question how to do it and how to secure under conditions of great uncertainty, how to secure production, how not only to achieve much, but overcome vulnerability is a major question for every agrarian civilization. And what we have come to learn, and the example of the Brazil is the serves me right, is that traditional systems had sources of knowledge, flexible techniques that we should not idealize. This is not about romanticizing pre-scientific knowledge, but there's a lot to be learned from the flexibility and complexity that is hidden in their histories. But instead of taking the main road and focusing on production, I'd like you to move to consumption without ignoring consumption. Consumption has been discovered in the past 30, 40 years by cultural theorists and sociologists as such a complex process. And obviously it's not enough to know things about the production of food, but why do some people think that some foods are edible and some are not? Why do some foods are considered satisfying, are considered real food? How come that even if we measure calorie or protein intake, people still maintain certain cultural repertoires, certain foodways that they cling to? And if we are not going to replace these people, but to live with them, or actually enable them to make livelihood, taking this seriously and see how these systems are transformed is simply not a luxury. It's really essential. The last point about the approach I'm taking is that I shall not be focusing, although it makes things very easy, on single ingredients, on macronutrients, is that the term, or the micronutrients, but combinations and whole systems of culinary systems. Foods do not come the way we would like them to come. Young people in Tel Aviv do not simply go for alcohol; they go for specific beers, and beers go with other things. These combinations are what actually make food system. So food is so interesting for us historians because it's biological, cultural, and social at the very same time. It's intensively a matter that you can measure, that we can describe, ignoring people's feelings, emotions, and attitudes. But at the same time, it is radically shaped by social systems of production and consumption, and the cultural preferences that are embedded in the way they do it. Now let's see how I manage with. Okay, that should be better. And it seems to me, at least from a very superficial attempt to make to know where I've come to, is that some current approaches to food security also recognize that this is not just about single ingredients, but about foodways, about the complexity, about the way they are combined, and the way that cultures provide for people's needs. So I think there is a way in which the historical study of foodways and current studies of food security can actually contribute something to our knowledge, especially when it comes to understanding this unique combination we find in foodways. The tenacity. They may be long-term traditions. They seem to be resistant to change and at the same time very elastic. So before points I'll try to make in the following. One, I'll try to describe, I think, one of the most useful attempts by the great anthropologist Sidney Mintz to uncover a system behind the enormous variety of foodways, and Mintz's model is the CVL model that we can apply and see working in very different civilization. Then I'll try to give an example of how cultural context was at the basis of the most traditional thing we can think about when it comes to food, that is the consumption of bread in Europe. Europe was not always a bread culture. It took more or less 800 years of intensive cultural contact, experimenting with breeding and with techniques in order for Europe to get serialized, as we call it. Then I'll try very briefly to point to two major revolutions in the history of foods, the Abbasi, the Arab, and the American one, and then give some illustration of the passage to modernity and its risks so that we won't remain very pre-modern. But this is more or less where I begin in the mapping of civilization before the year 1000 almost everywhere on our planet. Now, Sidney Mintz, who's a historical anthropologist, after several years of studying full cultures over the world, has identified the model that he calls the CVL model that you can see here, the core fringe legume pattern. And his idea is simple, that although on the surface we find an enormous variety, we can identify a functional system that is very, very efficient, that is elastic, and that can explain in many cases how change comes about. Change is basically not replacing the system, but adopting a different element for an existing function. So in Mintz's construction, we have a core of food, the basic staple, where most calories come from, and you have a list of examples here from wheat to barley, oats and rice, quinoa, manioc, or sweet potatoes, or potatoes if you really at it. This is where most people feed on. But these are combined with two other elements. One element, legume or pulse in its different forms, gives especially is important in terms of protein intake. So we have in this function we can see peas starring all sorts of beans, peanuts, chickpeas in our regions, lentils elsewhere, and the two are combined in a dish that can vary from day to day, but you're still eating the very same hummus, three different forms, or you have full if you're really into variety. And there's a third element, which in terms of quantity is minor, but without it, life is not life and food is not food. It has a great symbolic value. It's expensive and associated with social prestige, but you have to have at least bits of it in order to get a real meal. At least once in a week or once in a month on special occasions, but this is where real food come from. And of course, meat in the Mediterranean is one example, but there are others as well. Now, what I ask you to think of is about the different combinations you can create by combining these elements within given constraints. People cannot afford a lot of fringe. They cannot afford a lot of meat. The core is very often and cooked and soft and it's chewy. That's where actually the mass and the feeling of overcoming hunger comes from. But you can also symbolically, this is a symbolic and aesthetic system, you change the colors of the food, you mark special occasions by varying the proportion between different elements of the system. Now, what you can have. You can have, for example, rice and red beans. And I don't have to show you, I'm not going to show pictures, I don't have time for this, but you can imagine how the formula more or less generates things that you're probably familiar with. I hope you moved recently to the Asian variant, which is rice with soybeans or mung beans, or every one of them. The first one would give you chili con carne or without carne. The second one, a variety of Asian foods. there's no reason to explain why wheat and chickpeas can get you almost anywhere in that part of the Mediterranean, or if you like majadara and not hummus, millet and lentils, or rice and lentils will do more or less the very same thing. So what you have is a kind of a vocabulary with set elements, with basic functions that are not necessarily articulated in the culture, but this is how people actually create traditional food that is nutritious, that you can live on for a long time, and you can even imagine that is variegated, although compared to our modern sense of variety, this looks extremely traditional. But this is very, very effective. Now, when new agricultural options arise, when new foods come in, they are not simply entering as substances written on an empty slate, on a clean slate. They are entering a system, and they have to be classified according to cultural perceptions and enter specific points into this process. One local example is eggplants in the Middle East, the poor man's meat. Eggplants enter precisely into a pre-existing slot, the one in the fridge that was reserved for meat. And of course, tomatoes would enter specifically into that salt. So what my first point would be simply to recognize that we can do here a history of elastic and stable system, and that we should recognize that this is more or less, if Mintz is right, and until now there's no major refutation, if Mintz is right, this is what most people around the globe in agrarian civilization, not on shepherd communities, this is how people survived until more or less the year 1800, that is the beginning of the modern world, and in other parts of the world until last night, that is the Second World War. Now, my second point is just to exemplify that traditional food system could also actually undergo major revolutions, and to say a word or two about the conditions under which this could happen. I'm beginning with the Mediterranean culture, in which our CVL is basically wheat, and as you can see in the previous one, to the wheat you can add different sorts of proteins as legume, and of course the fringe would be anything from olive oil to garlic, tahini, mincemeat, and what have you. But the basic Mediterranean formula is of course the one where the core of the CVL is wheat, and where oil, specifically either oil or butter, later become central. Here is one way of describing what happens at the late antiquity. That is where Germanic tribes actually bring the downfall of the Roman Empire, the last incarnation of a unified Mediterranean civilization. And in the traditional story, we have the barbarians coming in, and the brave Romans, or the terrible Romans, depending on whose tradition you're reading, actually crumble apart and bring about an age of barbarism. This is an encounter between people who imagine themselves like this. This is Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor, and people, who imagine themselves, or able to imagine themselves this way. But from our perspective, this is one of the greatest and most fascinating cases of two civilizations coming together, imagining each other as its opposite, but gradually creating a synthesis, and we are eating the result until this very day. So to be very, very, to put it in a very general way, you have the Mediterranean culture of wine versus the Germanic cult of ale, which would turn into beer in the 16th century. You have a civilization defining itself, be it in Mesopotamia, in Iraq, Egypt, or ancient Palestine, as a civilization of people who eat bread, a very complicated product that no one understood how it was actually produced until the 19th century. Whereas barbarians eat porridge, gruel, soups of every sort. They're not sophisticated enough even to consume or to prepare real bread. And you have cultural ideals of self-mastery in the Greek, the Roman, or the Jewish way against the Germanic cult of virility. These are warrior societies, and perhaps the best example is that they really like roast meat. That nothing a Germanic aristocrat would prefer to having a barbecue. And I have a wonderful example here that we can't reel about the Emperor Charles the Great trying very much to be a Christian saint, trying to be a Roman aristocrat, being the person who refounded the Roman Empire in 800, but his biographer has to admit that the guy was simply crazy about roast meat, and that his huntsmen used to bring him roast meat, and when he becomes old, I mean, he also a major drinker, but no more than 3 huge cups for every meal. This is what a very pious biographer has to do. So in the figure of Charles the Great, of the Emperor Charlemagne, you see the different traditions come together, and a biographer trying only rhetorically to mediate between Germanic ideals of virility. They wanted him to give up the roast. That's what his physicians are telling him. And Charles, more or less 70, going and asking for some more barbecue. But what I'm really interested in is the synthesis that comes about gradually through the first 1,000 years of European history. So on the one hand, you can see the Mediterranean exporting wine and bread to European civilization, both of them enshrined in the major rituals of Jewish and Christian religion. You must have remembered what Jesus said in the final supper. So it's basically about unleavened bread and wine as the two elements of ancient Mediterranean societies. But at the very same time, the so-called barbarians actually bring into being different ingredients that merge with the Mediterranean tradition. For example, people come to adopt rye and oats that the Romans have considered actually as weeds and something to get rid of. And they would adopt barley as something that both horses are very much fond of, and all beer drinkers of the world should be thankful for. So it becomes wine and beer, and specifically it becomes both white wheat and rye, that is black bread. And we cannot count the number of people in Europe that until the 19th century owe their lives to the fact of not being able to afford white bread. This was one major advantage of the poor over the rich. So we have a new formula that is arising gradually in Europe as Europe is getting serialized. That is, when people gradually adopt bread instead of the different sorts of porridges or actually burnt wheat that they eat. We have our major, just look at the history of the world, company coming from the things that go with bread, kumpani, the things that you eat with your mates, with your companions, as you eat together. But you eat together, you create social bonds around bread, but what matters in terms of social status is what do you eat apart from bread. That would be the basic social cleavage from the year 1000, not earlier, 1100, until well into the 19th century. A major point is that this is not necessarily so understandable in purely economic terms, because pre-modern wheat was costly if you compare the proportion between the price of bread and the price of meat, as you can see here. But you can still, first of all, measure what poverty is in the pre-modern world by asking how much money would you spend from your income on bread, and 50% would be quite nice. In some English poor communities, we have 60% being spent on bread. And on the other hand, there's the cleavage between the white and the black bread, which in their world means biology and culture at the same time. White bread is not only appropriate if you're an aristocrat, it's good for you. If aristocrats would become consuming black bread, they won't be aristocrats. You'll see their body being shaped by their social status. And on the other hand, if poor people would begin to consume white bread, this is not good for their nature, not only for their social status. So what is crucial is that it takes more or less 1,000 years for Europe to become a bread civilization and to develop a viable CVL model that is more or less in place until the early modern period. There are only two major changes in this long-term history. I think you like this, but I think we'll talk about it later. You can, if you do medieval archaeology, you can also see on people's teeth that they do not have our problems with too much sugar, but they're because techniques of grinding were imperfect. There was so much grit in the bread that they were eating not only ground stuff, but the bits of pieces that remain. And in addition, since bakers had to make a living, and it was difficult to control, and prices were under control in major cities, one thing that bakers used to do was to make their loaves smaller by the day or by the week in order to respond to the oscillations of prices of grain in the market, or to enrich their bread with little stones, and let's not have all the list, with whatever they could in order to make their bread a bit heavier when the municipal inspector comes in. If you eat this for long, you can really see on people's teeth the long-term results. So no cavities, no sugar, but bad bread for everyone. Two major changes that I'll have to review very, very swiftly. One is what we call the Abbasid, the Arab agricultural revolution that changed our world. And the second, of course, is the American one. It's very easy to say that until the arrival of artificial foods in the 20th century, this is more or less what we have and what we've learned in 3,000 years of history. The Abbasid Empire is interesting because it creates a unified legal, religious, and political space from Spain until India. And what this enables is an enormous amount of exchange. Merchants, missionaries, scholars, going from different places, mixing cultures and traditions. And within huge cultural laboratory, what we have is not simply the import, but the adaptation of foods coming from different civilizations for the first time. That is, we have foods coming from Africa, especially a series of foods coming from India, and being adapted quite consciously to Mediterranean conditions by the caliphs and their helpers. And then, from this hotbed of cultural innovation, they go into Europe. Let's just look at the list. We can't really discuss it. But durum wheat, no pasta without durum wheat, the introduction of Asiatic sorts of rice, sorghum, and sugarcane, sour orange, nata, sweet oranges, lemons being eaten in Beirut in the 12th century, the bananas which do not make people mad at the period, watermelons, eggplants, artichokes, which are really a fine product for the sophisticated market, not to forget spinach, of course, without which no one can really survive. These are just some of the basic new foods and plants that are the result of the Abbasid revolution. And this happens within the space of about 200 years. Now, this is happening not as a matter of cultural contact rising out of itself, but because the caliphs in the 8th and 9th century have a distinct policy of importing new medicines and new technologies into the empire. They invite Indian physicians, they send actually people in order to acquire new technologies and sorts of knowledge. They subsidize farmers who adopt the new foods. So this is something that is unbelievable and that should not have happened in the pre-modern world. The heart of some of these innovations are the gardens that caliphs have near their palaces. Gardens which are both an aesthetic, a religious, and a scientific object at the same time. Gardens is where you actually fiddle with existing plans. This is where they really experiment with whatever they can do, and it's essential, simply because I'm talking too fast, just to say that this is not just about science, because science and religion are intertwined here to an unbelievable extent. A garden is pleasing to God. The garden is an earthly reflection of paradise. There's an ancient Persian tradition that you can see in the eastern parts of the Middle East of the garden as a model of godly perfection. So by tinkering with plants in your garden, by laying out a perfect surrounding, this is Damascus, to the extent that we would be once able to see it. This is the major Umayyad mosque in Damascus, portraying the garden, and this is mosaics, and we have some of the inscriptions telling, specifically saying that what we wanted was to depict paradise on earth, with a nice combination of water system, irrigation, and plants. So let us just, I think it would be useful just to know that in order to understand scientific and cultural innovation, we simply cannot look at religious tradition as something that simply hampers, that hinders all sorts of innovation. Now, the second big, of course, innovation, and I can only list it and in order to whet your appetites, is the American story. Almost everything you eat is American foods. You know this. If you can have the list in writing later, you can find it on the internet. What I think is important for understanding how food cultures change is that, for example, not everything, first of all, that is just one story of import and export. The story of the beans is amazing because most of the beans we now eat are American beans, the kidney beans, the white beans. We even took the old Latin name for the local Mediterranean beans and applied it to the American beans. So we have the great invasion of American beans, and at the same time the export of what is called lubia, or black-eyed peas later, from the Mediterranean to the Americans, and so that black soul food is actually Mediterranean, whereas every nice meal in the Mediterranean is based on American beans. The second point is that in many cases, what is interesting is not the adoption, but the rejection of new foods. Potatoes were rejected. Tomatoes were rejected. They did not fit an existing category, whereas turkeys were accepted by the European aristocracy, because otherwise, on a real festive occasion, you would actually like to have birds on your plate, because they are higher and loftier than other foods. So, and the best you can have is peacocks. Turkeys came as a replacement food for peacocks. But the fact that tomatoes and potatoes were rejected tells us something about the differential cultural accessibility, the differential attitudes that cultures adopt vis-à-vis new foods, and the difference is interesting. Italians would begin to adopt tomatoes in the 19th century, whereas in the Ottoman Empire you have recipes for tomatoes of every sort already around 1600. So there's a 300 years of difference between the Ottoman innovation that actually, from which we profit until this very day, to the Italian one, which is the first globalized food since the 20th century. I'm almost finishing. The bad news is that the CVL system, can I have just 4 minutes just to make the final point, is that the CVL system is radically undermined in modern times. First, it undermined from the fringe by the introduction of new luxuries, especially sugar, coffee, and later cocoa, but this is limited in scope. The basic pattern, the first food that actually undermines local system is sugar, and sugar is interesting because it creates, I'm jumping around, because it creates a global economy in which African slaves, Central European plantations, and British workers with bread and jam actually are combined to form a new global system of production and consumption. No industrialization without bread and jam and sugar tea, but also no industrialization without black slaves taken from Africa to the Caribbean. But sugar is just the harbor of the first harbor of the basic process that ushers in the new world, which is a world since the 19th century, first of all in Britain, in which sugars and fats and of course meat is rising. I don't have time to show you the numbers, but the Brits are the first in the world to have a global economy in which the colonies produce enough food, meat and fodder in order to feed the new working class and people who actually abandon agriculture in favor of living in the cities. And by 1914, this is really fast forward, but we got to have a world war to finish it. By 1914, this is already more or less a situation that we know that comes familiar to us now. By 1914, most industrial nations in Europe already work against hard constraints and the question how to produce food. And whereas the British and of course the Americans in a different way have mass supplies, the British through an empire, the Americans through the homegrown, home-based agriculture, Germany is not the only country that knows that although we tend to describe the history of modernity as a story of industry, behind it there's the big story of food supply. And the Germans know very well that they are strategically dependent on food supplies from a global economy they cannot control. They try to do it at home and they fail. And this is one of the major reasons for the First World War. So hunger in the 20th century is both what drives world wars and one of the consequences of major world wars. And this is not just Germany. This is just the story of Italian attempt to colonize Libya and Ethiopia, or the Japanese attempt to take over Manchuria. We got to have places where enough agricultural surplus can be produced in order to feed ourselves. This is food security. Or this is a way of securing food the violent way, and what we are now discussing is more or less a situation that has arisen after the Second World War for about 50 years, which for us historians is next to nothing, in which for a while we were utterly optimistic about food security. So let's see what you can do about it. Let's finish here. Thank you.